Well, he stabbed her to the heart, and the life blood did flow. He stabbed her to the heart, and the life blood did flow. Into the grave pretty Polly did go. Well, he threw a little dirt over her and turned to go home. He threw a little dirt over her and turned to go home, while the wild birds and turtle doves were left there to mourn. Hello and welcome to Kevin Teaches Music. In today's traditional song lesson, we are delving into a very old and very unique and possibly, controversial song that's called Pretty Polly. You just heard a couple of strains of it there. Pretty Polly is a murder ballad, which is exactly what it sounds like. A song that describes somebody committing a murder. By the end of this video, you'll have a handle on the song in terms of the melody and a head start on getting the lyrics down. You'll also have an understanding for what murder ballads are and some of the role that they've played in ballad history, and hopefully you'll be able to form a well-educated opinion about how we should understand these songs, how we should perceive them, and when it might be appropriate to perform them and when it might not be. So, without further ado, I will sing the whole song for you. As you get used to the melody, maybe try humming along a little bit. But I would also encourage you to listen to the lyrics very closely and take note of how each line makes you feel, because I think that I want to encourage a discussion about this song. And so really listen to the lyrics and feel free to pause and replay, this section of the video, this where I sing the song, if you want to go back and practice certain parts of the melody or the words. And for my Patreon subscribers, make sure to check the attachments. I will be including the lyrics there as a PDF. So, Pretty Polly. Pretty Polly, come go along with me. Pretty Polly, come go along with me. Before we get married, some pleasure we'll see. Well, she got on behind him, and away they did go. She got on behind him, and away they did go, o'er the hills and mountains and the valley so low. Well, they went up a little further, and what did they spy? They went up a little further, and what did they spy? A new dug grave and a spade lying by. Oh, Willie, I'm afraid of your way. Oh, Willie, I'm afraid of your way. I'm afraid you will lead my poor body astray. Oh, Polly, your guess is 'bout right. Oh, Polly, your guess is about right. Well, I dug on your grave the biggest part of last night. Then he stabbed into the heart, and her life blood did flow. He stabbed into the heart, and her life blood did flow. Into the grave pretty Polly did go. Well, he threw a little dirt over her and turned to go home. He threw a little dirt over her and turned to go home, while the wild birds and turtle doves were left there to mourn. There you have it. That's Pretty Polly. So let's talk about this song. It's kind of a weirdly blunt song, isn't it? There's not really much left to the imagination. There doesn't really seem to be anything metaphorical about it. It's pretty much straightforwardly just somebody gets murdered. Which really isn't funny at all, but it's just kind of a weird. It's kind of funny in a weird way, you know. For this to be a song, you know, I mean, there are all kinds of songs that feature murder, but there's not a lot that just go from beginning to end. Yep, this person got killed, and then the song ends. You know, usually there's some story or some development or maybe there's a story of regret or shame or guilt or some sort of argument. But yeah, this one's just very straightforward. It's just this very brutal, sort of grisly murder. No motivation is mentioned. No fallout is described. And then the song just ends very abruptly. So that right away is kind of interesting. And then notably, well, like I said, we're not told Willie's motivation. We don't know if he regrets the murder. And this is rare for a murder ballad. Typically, the lyrics are going to include some sort of moral judgment or condemnation, whether that be from the narrative perspective, sort of the third person perspective, you know, where the narration will say, oh, this heinous crime or this awful act that he committed, blah, 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 or whether it be from the actual person in the story. You know, the narration will say, oh, then he went away and regretted this crime or this, you know, turned himself in to the police or confessed to this horrible crime. Something that's showing that the perpetrator himself actually realizes the horrific nature of this action. But none of that happens in this particular setting of Pretty Polly. And I say particular setting for a reason, because as you know, all of the ballads that I teach and discuss, they all have many versions. They're all part of the oral tradition, and so there are other versions of Pretty Polly that do include more detail. But in our version, it's just the stripped down story with the just the necessary details about the murder and really nothing else. So, yeah, you're sort of left at the end to draw your own conclusions. You know, the way I perceive this song, it kind of just shocks you with the story and then just leaves you. And you know, that's a very unique quality about this song. Now, speaking of that, is there anything behind this song, though? Or is that really just it? Is it really just a plain and simple murder with no explanation? Well, to answer that question, we will need to just do a brief survey of where the ballad comes from and its history. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to work my way backwards through time. So I'll start with where I got the ballad. I got it off of a CD. It's a wonderful CD called The Life of Riley, and it's by an artist named Riley Baugus. Baugus. Riley is a banjo player and singer living down in Surrey County, North Carolina, I believe at the moment. I met him a number of years ago at a trad music camp up in Maine, and was really just enamored by his music and bought the CD. And so Pretty Polly features on the CD. He performs it with a really nice bit of banjo picking in the background along with his singing. And on the CD, Riley talks about some of the musicians that he learned from, and he mentions Doc Boggs. That's another, if you're interested in Appalachian music and old-time music, Doc Boggs is a big name. He lived from 1898 to 1971, and he was famous as a banjo picker as well as a ballad singer. And we do have recordings of Doc Boggs singing Pretty Polly from the 1920s. So I think it's very likely that Riley may have gotten this song from the repertoire of Doc Boggs, given that Doc Boggs is one of the musicians that Riley mentions as being an influence on his CD. So we know that the song is floating around Appalachia in the early 20th century. Doc Boggs and some of his contemporaries, we know, performed the song. Before that, there's kind of a very murky, sort of unknown period of the ballad existing in Appalachia. But if we go back even further, not only in time, but also across the Atlantic, we find what in all likelihood was the sort of source ballad that ended up becoming Pretty Polly, albeit in very changed form. And this source ballad is called the Gosport Tragedy. So this is a broadside ballad printed first in Britain in 1727. So we're back about 200 years before Doc Boggs at this point. We're back across the Atlantic. So a lot is going to be different about this early ballad from its Appalachian form. And yes, a lot is different. The Gosport Tragedy recounts the story of a ship's carpenter who murders his pregnant girlfriend and boards the ship and is later confronted by her ghost. The ghost, the crew is sort of tormented by this ghost, and, they're wondering what is going on with this ghost. Very similar to actually the story of Jonah and the whale, in the sense that there's one crew member on board who's causing this supernatural misfortune, and then he's guilty of some crime, and then when he confesses, finally all is well. And in fact, there are some versions of the Gosport Tragedy where the problem is that the ship is beset by storms, similarly to in the biblical story of Jonah. But anyway, so the crew is basically confronted by this ghost, and then the man who committed the murder eventually has to confess. In some versions, he dies. In some versions, he doesn't die. But so it's a story of murder and sort of ghostly revenge, if you will. And the interesting thing about the Gosport Tragedy is, it is a ballad. It is not meant to be a historical account necessarily, but one researcher actually found some evidence of a very real event that might have been the inspiration for the Gosport Tragedy ballad. So there was a ship called the HMS Bedford that in 1726, so basically the year before this ballad, there was a ship's carpenter named John Bilson who died on this ship at sea on the 25th of September, 1726. And that may not seem that amazing to you, but what helps confirm it is that this HMS Bedford ship was anchored near the locations described in the ballad, Gosport Tragedy, and that one of the characters named by name in the ballad was a guy named Charles Stewart, said to be part of the crew. There was actually a real Charles Stewart on this very real historical ship, the HMS Bedford. So the person that wrote the ballad clearly was taking some inspiration from, it's very likely that this ballad was inspired by the very real death of this ship's carpenter, John Bilson, on board the HMS Bedford in 1726. Did John Bilson, had he previously murdered his pregnant girlfriend? I'm not sure. I don't think there's any record of that, but So whether that aspect of the story was fabricated out of thin air or whether he actually had murdered someone, I'm not sure. But so it has sort of a pseudo historical origin. Then it becomes the Gosport tragedy, this British broadside ballad, and then so I'm trying to connect it to the whole the Appalachian and Doc Boggs story. And so then it's going to cross the Atlantic, and it's going to evolve and change. And one thing that happens when ballads cross the Atlantic is they're going to lose any elements that are specific to people or places from England, and they're often going to be replaced by features, names, places, and or things that feel more distinctly American. But the thread of the story often remains the same. So now, instead of John Bilson and Charles Stewart on board the HMS Bedford, and the Gosport tragedy, now the focus is more on the murder. There's no ship involved because Appalachia isn't really near the ocean, and so it sort of loses certain elements that don't adapt well to the Appalachian style, and then other elements are brought to the forefront. So in the Appalachian versions, you'll often hear a little bit more about the murder itself, as opposed to the sort of ship episode afterwards. The murder episode, a part of the story, actually gets drawn out, and that sort of becomes the full ballad. So the Gosport tragedy sort of spawns this like small family of interrelated murder ballads in Appalachia, and one of those is Pretty Polly. So Pretty Polly loses the ship part, loses the ghost part, and in our version, which again is not the only version, but in our version, there's no account of the murderer regretting his action, and there's no description of any motivation. It's really just stripped down to the barest bones, just telling the story of the murder, which is a very interesting effect. So now that we have talked about the history of this ballad, and we have a little bit of context for where it comes from, and the evolution and the changes, I think the question that I want to ask, the question that I want to end with is, does this song normalize violence? Is this song problematic in any way, or is it an appropriate song to continue to perform and to perpetuate in the traditional singing community? And because it can feel sort of unsettling that the narrator of the song doesn't seem to have a problem with the murder that just happened. There's no final verse saying, "Oh, what a horrible action," or how regrettable and how tragic that this thing occurred. It really is just a portrait of a crime. And I think that we're very used to songs offering moral lessons, of narrate, the narrative voice of a song, of sort of almost Aesop's fable like kind of, summarizing at the end and saying, okay, well, this is what happened, and it was very, very bad, or it was very, very good, and hear ye, like, do this or don't do this, or some sort of lesson. And so it can be a little bit surprising to hear about this murder and then the song just ends. But I think that the answer to the question of whether it's appropriate and whether it's problematic, I think it depends on the perception of each individual listener. Because when you're hearing these songs, or when you're performing these songs, it's ultimately each listener's personal responsibility to avoid allowing any problematic views that may be, represented in the song into your own psyche. So whether that be misogyny or sort of, I say misogyny because in a lot of murder ballads, it's almost always a man murdering a woman, and often there's this element of she's pregnant, or some other situation that just highlights how poorly women were treated, and throughout history. So that's why I say misogyny can be present there, or a sort of a normalization of violence, or almost a romanticization of certain kinds of crimes. But sorry, so to get back to the point, it's the listener's responsibility to keep all of those elements in the song and not allow them to actually get into your own mind and affect your own personal morals and or convictions. Just the same way that we expect people to be able to read literature from, read literature either from an earlier time period where perhaps moral standards were unfortunately different, or to be able to read about crimes and not have that actually, affect your beliefs. And so that's why I say I do think it's up to the individual listener to have that discretion and to have that understanding and maturity. But even that being said, I think Pretty Polly is actually an example of a murder ballad that I do think conveys the correct moral tone, even if it's not super explicit. Well, it is explicit, in one sense in describing the murder, but it's not explicit in its condemnation of the murder. But I think that it does accomplish it through, it sort of has this very mournful melody, and you get the sense that the singer, the narrator, is lamenting the fact that Pretty Polly has been killed, right? I'm afraid you'll lead my poor body astray. Like words like poor, they do kind of have an effect on the listener. And then especially at the end, the lyrics hint at a little bit of a condemnation with the lyrics, and the wild birds and turtle doves were left there to mourn. That's definitely showing a very sad outlook on this event. That these animals, these wild birds, are lamenting this sad thing that has just happened. So that I think is kind of I like that. I think it's not too on the nose. It's kind of subtle. It leaves a little bit up to you to decide how you feel about it. So it kind of shocks you with the narrative, and then there's just that little hint at the end of the narrator actually being sad in through relating the sentence about these wild birds. So I do like Pretty Polly, and I do think it's a good song to perpetuate. I think it's a very unique song, and it's worth mentioning that there are other versions of Pretty Polly that actually do recount the remorse of the man who commits this murder and how he regrets this crime. And there are versions that are more explicit about describing it as being this terrible crime, etc., etc. But even so even though I do like Pretty Polly, and I think it's worth performing and perpetuating, when you're singing any murder ballad, especially when you're singing any murder ballad, for example, Pretty Polly, you do have to know your audience, and you have to use discretion to determine how your particular audience is going to react to the song, how they're going to be affected by it, and how they're going to understand it. And if possible, maybe use a little disclaimer to try to guide your audience to a more mature understanding of the song. Make sure to, let your audience know, whether it be your friends, your family, or a concert, a concert audience. Explain to them that murder ballads can be understood and viewed as sort of almost historical curiosities. Like this is how this murder was described and sort of put into song form at this time. And even if it wasn't a real murder, but not necessarily this is how we should view these events today. So not really taking ideas and concepts from the song, but rather almost like a piece of old literature. This is this was described in 1820 or 1726 or 1910 or what have you. So more of a historical piece rather than a source of inspiration or emotion. So that is Pretty Polly for you. If you enjoy that song as much as I do, I hope that you'll incorporate it into your repertoire. Just go back and if you want to work on the song, just go back and check out the section of the video where I sang it. And you can also learn the song from Riley Bogus's CD, The Life of Riley, which is a fantastic album. His other albums are also worth checking out, as well as Doc Boggs, whom I mentioned, has a lot of music worth checking out. And another artist that I didn't mention, but that does sing some really cool Appalachian murder ballads related to Pretty Polly, is Doc Watson. I think he might sing Pretty Polly as well. I'll have to check. But yeah, Riley Bogus, Doc Boggs, and Doc Watson are going to be the artists to check out. Let me know in the comments what you think about this ballad, Pretty Polly, and about murder ballads in general. If we have enough, if we have enough interest, maybe we can do a full episode all about murder ballads and comparing and contrasting, different examples and looking at the history, because they're very fascinating and they go back really, really far. And there's a couple ones with some really cool plot twists that kind of turn the genre on its head. If you have made it to the end of this video, then hopefully you enjoy some of these kinds of topics. And so you might be interested in joining my Patreon. That's patreon.com/KevinElamMusic, where you can support my creative endeavors and get access to exclusive updates and videos. So check that out if you haven't already. All right, folks, thank you for joining me. Until next time, happy singing.